This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's oral history program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on April the 13th, 1972. The interview was conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is former Governor of Oklahoma, Mr. Dewey Bartlett. This interview was conducted at Oklahoma Christian College. The interview is being re-recorded on March the 26th, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
You want to...
One, two, three.
Okay.
All right.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is April the 13th, 1972. We're in the control room at Oklahoma Christian College with former Governor Dewey Bartlett from Tulsa, Oklahoma, as being interviewed. We will move right into this interview because of the need to cover a lot in a somewhat limited amount of time. Governor Bartlett, I wanted to begin with if you would tell us a little of your personal background, who your parents were, where they were from, and where you grew up.
My father was David Albert Bartlett, a banker and an oil man, an early oil man. He was one of the first bankers who loaned money to people engaged in the oil business and used to take loans from the old Exchange Bank in Tulsa and take over the loans for his bank in Marietta, Ohio. He was an early-day oil operator and followed the oil industry from Pennsylvania into West Virginia, Sistersville area. Marietta, lived there with his first wife, who died, and then later he married my mother. My mother was Jessie Follett, a family of Democrats, incidentally, with two members of the Supreme Court of Ohio, one the head of the Supreme Court, another a member of the Supreme Court. One was Chief Justice. And as I said, they were Democrats. My mother was a Republican, and my aunt, with whom I spent a lot of time and whom I was very fond, was a very strong Democrat. So they didn't talk politics too much. I was born in 1919, attended schools in Marietta, then later went to Lawrenceville School, where I engaged in basketball and track. Later went to Princeton, graduated in 1942, played basketball there on the varsity team for 3 years. I enlisted in the Navy in January of 42, went into service in June, right after graduation. I took some training at the North Base at Norman. Got my wings, and at that time was a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. I saw overseas duty, finally ended up as a captain in the reserve, and was a combat dive bomber pilot.
When did you get into Oklahoma as an adult?
Well, I was here in the summers of 40 and 41, working in the oil fields in the Bartlesville area. I used to stay in the YMCA there, pack my lunch at the old Dewey Hotel where my father had stayed back in the early 1900s. And incidentally, a town was named after my father in Oklahoma many years ago, called Bartlett, east of Henrietta, and it later was changed to the town of Dighton. Dighton's a very small town now at the present time.
Now, you came back here after the war, is that correct?
Well, I first was here in the summer of 40 and 41 in the oil fields and around Dewey and Bartlesville. Also, I spent some time at Kanawha.
And then when you returned after the war?
Then I returned in 1966 permanently. I was then married to my wife, Ann, who hails from Seattle. We met in California.
Let's get that year again. In what year? You said
19. Did I say
66?
I meant to say 46.
1946.
Yes.
Now, what did you? What happened at that time in '46? What did you go into?
I received my degree as an engineer, geological engineer, and so I started working with the Keener Oil Company, which was and is a family company, and later became an operating partner. We became a partnership. At that time, we were a corporation, and my brother still runs it. I haven't been active in it in over 6 years.
This is Robert Bartlett?
No, David Bartlett, my brother.
David Bartlett, excuse me. Now, when did you gain an interest in politics?
Well, I had an interest all along. I was precinct chairman when Eisenhower ran the first time, and our precinct carried for him with a larger majority than any precinct in Tulsa. It was a good precinct, but I think we felt we made it a little bit better. Later, in 1960, went to Europe with my wife. I contracted hepatitis when I came back, which put me on the shelf for a while, and I was unable to do very little other than just write or read, mainly read. And at that time, I read a lot about early American history and became more interested in politics. And this led to finally my serving on a committee to try to interest some people running for the state Senate on the Republican Party against incumbent in Tulsa. And when I couldn't find anybody, I finally decided to consider it myself. One of the significant things that happened, which was sort of humorous, I asked my daughter what she thought I should do, and she said, well, go ahead and run, Daddy. And I reminded her I might lose, and she said, well, tough bazookies. And there was really a lot of meaning in that tough bazookies, and it reminded me that many businessmen, I think of running for office, and most of them decide not to, I think mainly because they're not used to losing. And I think this was a concern to me at that time, and my daughter was telling me that I certainly was old enough to accept the hazards of a political election.
Who did you run against?
Well, I was an incumbent, died during the campaign.
Oh.
And then another man, and I can't think of his name, replaced him, and whom I ran against.
You've had too many bigger races since then.
So.
I bet you remember who you ran against for governor.
Mr. Moore. Preston Moore.
Why don't you tell about your first service in the Senate?
Well, I enjoyed that very much. It was quite an eye-opener for me. I was given some very good advice before I started serving, and that was just to judge everybody as I found them. And I found some of the people a little differently than their reputations would lead you to believe. But I found there were some very, very fine people in the Senate. I introduced a lot of legislation to repeal the Jim Crow laws, and these were all passed. I think there was one or two constitutional amendments submitted to the people. I introduced later a bill which created a free port. Finally, a constitutional amendment was submitted to the people for a free port bill, which exempts goods in interstate commerce from the personal property tax under certain conditions. And this makes a free port state an attractive state for warehousing or for manufacturing because it encourages people to have warehouses where the goods that are produced or kept within certain time limits are not subject to personal property taxes. This seems to me to be a very reasonable approach, and it certainly helped Oklahoma expand its industry. I was interested in education and introduced several bills. Perhaps the one that's had the most impact on the state was I was the principal author of the 10 mill levy. I know, looking back, I remember at the time people were saying, including some of those very key people in education, that, well, the people would never, the legislature would never pass it. I think Furman Phillips told me that. And even if they did, I think he said, well, the people wouldn't pass it. And of course they did. And I think he said, well, if they did, the voters wouldn't vote it in the individual districts. But now, by far, the great majority of the various school districts have voted the extra 10 mil levy, and it has provided much for education and improved education much in Oklahoma.
Who do you consider, you served a period in the Senate with a number of people, a number of interesting personalities. Who do you consider the most, or maybe one or two you consider the most interesting personalities, or either interesting or memorable personalities you served with in the Senate?
Oh, of course, the Senate was full of interesting personalities. Ray Fine was sort of a combination of philosopher, perhaps a little bit of Will Rogers, and a little bit of Abraham Lincoln. He's quite an orator and struck quite a figure when he spoke. Rather angular person, and he's very humorous. Make his point very well, and he was interesting to watch. Very capable speaker. Joe Bailey Cobb had a lot of color, and I think you could just name practically the whole Senate at that time, and there were among the members some very colorful individuals.
You served in the Senate during the reapportionment period, and of course you saw, in some respects, almost a new Senate come in your second round. Could you discuss the reapportionment a little bit and how you feel it affected the basic content of the Senate?
Well, it changed the representation. For example, in Tulsa County, I was one senator for the entire county. The census showed the county had 346,000 people at that time, so as a state senator, I had a larger constituency than many congressmen had. It was even more exaggerated in the case of Senator Cleta John Rogers from Oklahoma City. Tulsa County ended up with 7 senators, and I believe at that time Oklahoma County had 8. The representation of the Senate after apportionment was what I felt was a pretty balanced situation. About a third of them were from the 2 big cities, Tulsa and Oklahoma City, 2 big counties. About a third were from districts that were dominated by a fairly sizable town, and about a third were from strictly rural areas. So I felt that the balance of power really lay with those senators from the districts dominated by a large city, but also having very definitely rural parts to it, rural areas and rural interests. And I think maybe this was a very healthy thing, and I think this does exist to a great extent today.
What part did you play in the reapportionment effort?
Well, of course, the reapportionment effort was really played by the courts, but I did support reapportionment and felt very definitely that there needed to be a change of representation so that people were better represented than they had been for many, many years.
Now, you served the 2 years following in your new ones. Thinking of the new senators that you served with, could you name some of the personalities there that you found to be particularly memorable to you?
Well, Senator Finis Smith from Tulsa was a new senator who became one of the 7 senators after reapportionment, and he is currently just finishing his second term as President Pro Tem. There are one of the senators with whom I served in the first session, Senator Bob Lawler from Miami, a Democrat, later was my liaison with the legislature and a very fine person. Denny Garrison, Republican, was the minority leader of the Senate and a very good friend. Trying to think, well, I just can't think of another name, but the Senate was increased from 40 to 44 rather to 48 with reapportionment.
Why don't you talk about the things that led up to your running for governor? Possibly, maybe there's some behind-the-scenes things that convinced you that you would get in this race for governor.
Well, my first thought when I saw Henry Bellman one evening when I was scheduled to meet with him about 7 o'clock, and came in the side door to his office and found him sitting there erect and asleep, and knew he was worn out with everything he was doing, that I decided at that point I never did want to try to be governor. But as I became more interested and more knowledgeable of state government, I realized that, or I thought that there could be a possibility of another Republican succeeding Henry Bellman, and I felt that I might have a good chance for that. So beginning in the summer of 1965, I started, I took first a 3-day trip. I remember I first went to Sapulpa and then Pawnee and spent that evening in Ponca City, and then on out to Woodward. Was with Bill Burkett in Woodward, Granny Williams, senator with whom I served in office with in the Senate. And so I did touch base with people in the western part of the state, and it was my guess that Happy Camp would also be running for this office, and he did do that. And so I was feeling the pulse in the area where he was strong and felt that I did get along with the people and knew that they would be supporting him if he ran, and they did. But I also felt that if I were successful in winning the primary, that they would be very willing to support me, which would be vital to becoming elected. And this happened. I felt pretty strongly that after the 1964 election, with the defeat of Goldwater and a disastrous convention in San Francisco, that the Republican Party had only two ways to go. One was down and out, and the other was to snap back. And I felt the chances were good that it would snap back, and it did. And I think this was helpful to my election in 1966. Also, I think the fact that Henry Bellman was very popular and supporting me very strongly had a lot to do with our success.
Do you think the fact that you had a primary race, which meant that you had more exposure during that period, would help you any?
Oh, yes, Penn, it helped a lot. Both Happy and I felt that we became much better known even after the runoff. At the beginning of that race, there were 17 candidates. Then both parties had runoffs, and so that put it down to 4 for a 3-week period. And during that period, the 4 of us got a lot of exposure. And in that 3-week period, both Happy and I felt that we became much better known. I think another key to our success in the election was the fact that Happy Camp and his wife Vera supported us very strongly in the final election, in the general election. They were very, very helpful. Happy campaigned with me on a number of occasions and was extremely helpful in our success.
Is there anything you can think of in the primary or within the Republican primary and runoff that is memorable that we haven't mentioned?
Well, it was almost a tie in the primary.
Very close.
Very close, and Happy Camp, of course, is a very good campaigner, a very popular person, a very qualified person. He later played a key role as chairman of the Board of Affairs in our administration, and of course now is serving as congressman from the 6th District. But we were friends before, but we really became very good friends through that. We had a hard-hitting primary, but I think a very, very friendly one.
Let's talk about the general election. Some of the things that happened in this, and those things that you feel were factors in your being elected.
Well, I think one of the early positions we took was very helpful, and that was on court reform. In the previous session, we had the Court of Impeachment, impeaching the Supreme Court Judge Johnston, and I supported very strongly reforming our judicial system. And this became somewhat of an issue in the campaign, and I think it was very helpful. I think also another issue of importance was my position against any general state tax increase. There were indications that our opponent had been for a tax increase, although he later took a position against it. So I think that Henry Bellman's support, some issues that developed in the campaign where we were differing from our opponent, and a strong position for more and better jobs for Oklahoma. We had a campaign slogan, job getting us governor. And later, after the election, we tried to prove that that was going to be accurate.
Remember, your billboard had you rolling up your sleeves on this particular thing.
Right.
Remember these. Do you feel that the fracture of the scars of the Democratic Party's runoff, what effect do you feel that may have had?
Oh, I think that was helpful. I think the attitude of Governor Gary, as it was with Governor Bellman, was helpful. And so I think that there were results of the Democratic primary that did tend to split some of the voters in the Democratic Party and for the general election.
Do you feel that your experience of legislative experience was helpful to you coming in as governor?
Oh, yes, very definitely. It's pretty hard to anticipate what the problems of a legislature or legislators are, and it just as it's difficult to anticipate those of a governor. And so I think having the legislative experience was very helpful to me in dealing with the legislature.
Well, why don't we talk a little about your about the committee that you had, your committee of businessmen, and some of the efforts that were made to save dollars through that. Your management study committee?
Yes.
Describe who it is and who some of the people were who participated in that.
Well, the management study committee evolved from a desire to have efficiency studies made of state government so that state government would be more efficient, so there could be savings of money and so on. There had been efforts along this line made during Governor Bellman's administration, and this had interested me. And because of this, I had several firms and individuals give estimates as to what this would cost. And then I happened to be back at a meeting in Ohio and learned what had been done in the state of Ohio. They called it a little Hoover Commission, but it was a group of, through the efforts of the governor's office, a group of businessmen were made available on a voluntary basis with their expenses paid for either by themselves or their company, with their time made available, so that in our case some 54 worked most of 4 months with Jimmy Allison, who had been earlier president of Warren Petroleum and a vice president of Gulf Oil Corporation, a real fine gentleman, Bob Wooten, who had been the defeated candidate for lieutenant governor, gave very freely of his time in raising some of the money that had to be raised for their expenses and in also recruiting people. But Jimmy Allison certainly is the one that deserves credit for having a real fine group of people made available from various companies, and there were the key companies in the state, and I think to start naming them, I'll be leaving a lot of them out, but most of the principal companies and banks made available their personnel. The key idea to this is that the study, unlike the original Hoover Commission, is not made by congressmen whose general daily duty is to make changes in the law and to bring about greater efficiency continually, but that the group doing the study is composed entirely of non-governmental people, businessmen. It was also agreed that in most cases, in fact almost all the cases, that the approach was not to try to change policy, but to make suggested changes of business practices with the ongoing policy as to how greater efficiency could be created and savings could be created. We felt that the results were good. The estimate was over roughly $45 million savings, with a number of suggestions, some to be made by executive action, some of the governor, some by boards and commissions, and others by legislation. We felt that afterwards, in a very conservative way, and I'll underline that or put it in quotes because I think that the figures were very conservative, over $20 million of savings were created. About $5 million of this actually was additional revenue from the higher interest rate investment of state monies. There was a lot of attention given to improving our treatment of state funds on deposit in the various banks. Much of it was not drawing interest, and since that time the state treasurer's office did see fit to raise the interest considerably and also to put more money on deposit earning interest. For example, in the highway department, at the end of my administration, it was spending annually about $25 million more for the construction and maintenance of roads compared to the beginning, and there were some 200 less people working in the highway department. There was an effort to make the School Land Commission department smaller, and it's a smaller department. The return on its investments were increased. A lot of efficiency was brought about, and so we felt the $20 million final savings was very good. I feel that if I had been reelected, I was planning to have a similar concentrated study in both public school and higher education. And I would believe now the legislature could take a good look at the management study report and find some programs that could be adopted. There was a lot of legislation that wasn't passed that I think could have been, that would have created additional savings. And I think it's very important that government continually make an effort to become more efficient. There's a profit motive in private business that's lacking in government, so it takes quite an extra effort. And I think the key to this program was having business people make the study, and another key was the ability of Jimmy Allison of doing everything in the open so that the press knew what was going on all the time. And they became quite interested in it, and I think the press gave it tremendous support and publicity, so that the people generally had a very favorable attitude to some of the programs. It was also interesting that a number of the people in state government, in some cases department heads, would go to one of our management study men and say, I wish you would look for this or this, and here's what you'll find. And they'd say, why don't you recommend this yourself? And they'd say, well, it's just a little bit of a hot potato. We don't want to do it. So we got good cooperation from most of the departments and a lot of good ideas from people working with it, but because of the realities of politics, because some of them didn't feel free to make the suggestions themselves. So I heartily endorse this approach and think this could be done very favorably at the federal level.
Were there some areas where you failed to sell what they were trying to do, where this committee was?
Well, I think that there were some areas, a number of them, Penn, where the legislature didn't go along. I don't know that I would say this was failure to sell. There was some politics involved, certainly with the Republican Party suggesting it, both houses of the Democratic Party.
I think the county commissioner thing, for example.
And you're referring to the central purchasing.
Yes,
yeah.
Central purchasing.
Yes, and now this I would say we did fail to sell this. I believe it was interesting. We had a series of meetings in my third year in office, private meetings with county commissioners and city council members, because I was very much aware of the fact of the need for coordination between local and state government and federal, and I had in mind then creating a new department, which was created during my last term in office to provide better coordination, planning and coordination between the community affairs department. Anyway, in the process of this, I met in several parts of the state with the county commissioners, Truman Branscombe, who was the director of the highway department, and we discussed central purchasing with them off the record. I found a great number of them supporting it privately. They were hung up on a open commitment to support the county commissioners who had taken a stand, but many of them favored it. Others had some misconceptions about it, and many of those were corrected. And so I think that in due time it will pass. I think it'll be a very good thing. There's no reason in the world that there should be any bad aspects to it, because if there's anything that, in other words, if it can't serve the county commissioners well in a certain product, or a certain type of equipment that they need, in other words, if it can't serve the county commissioners well in a certain product, or a certain type of equipment that they need, or certain things, then it shouldn't go through central purchasing. It should be done only to expedite, to save money, and to make life easier for the county commissioners. So it should be helpful to them rather than harmful.
National Guard reorganization came under your period when they announced the doing away with many of the divisions, and I know that you played an active role, and I know General Weber gives you a great deal of credit for the success Oklahoma had in salvaging some of the things which looked like were lost at the time. Why don't you talk about this whole aspect?
Well, I'll give General Weber real credit here. The plan that we developed was one of approaching the Pentagon, approaching the Secretary of Defense, and let's see, his name, McNamara, in a friendly way, rather than taking pot shots at him, as were many other governors. And so we approached them on the basis of recognizing that they had the authority to do what they proposed to do in the realignment of divisions and so forth. And we then made a series of requests of them to increase the number of personnel to change the makeup of our Guard, as was envisioned by the federal government, to include more engineers and also more military police, because we felt that was needed at that time, and to retain the shoulder patch of the Thunderbird Division, and several other very important requests. We had a very friendly conversation with the Secretary. The Oklahoma representative for the Army was with us, Don Kennedy from Oklahoma City, and we had a very fine meeting, and later learned that every single one of our requests was honored. We later found out that we were the only state that approached it this way, and so I think this had a lot to do with it. I think the fact that we didn't try to just oppose the Secretary head-on, but to try to work with him to have our Guard be as important for the state. The state function at that time was obviously very important because the riots around the country had started. There was real concern about the ability of the present training, about the present training situation, about the state function of the Guard to perform, and so we had some, real concern. We were very proud of our Guard. I think our Guard is certainly perhaps the best of all the states, and the new training was done very quickly, and the Guard, of course, performed very well every time it was even, whether there was any thought of using it at all. But I think that the success of this venture was due to General Weber.
Why don't we talk about civil unrest, since you touched on it, and how what your philosophy and your approach to it was, how Oklahoma in general approached it, and what results you feel you had by this approach.
Well, a friend of mine who had served in the Edmondson administration, Mike Pedrick, had been on the Board of Affairs, and when he's a Republican, when I was elected governor, he cautioned me that perhaps there needed to be some updating in the plan that existed for dealing with an emergency at the prisons. And so we looked into this early in my administration and found out that very definitely there was a need to update an emergency plan. Then, as the riots around the country were developing, we realized that we needed to broaden the emergency plan for the state to include handling riots, and so we had to think through the whole role of law enforcement. And we had a series of meetings with representative mayors and police chiefs and others. I found that in law enforcement, the local police, the sheriffs, highway patrol, the National Guard, and all these components were in very close touch and cooperation. I also found out that the mayors, and understandably so, were quite guarded about their prerogative of local law enforcement. So the approach that we made was one which honored the responsibility of law enforcement at the local level. The approach was that we wanted the mayors to know that if there was any threat to their community where their capabilities of dealing with it, because of the numbers involved, were threatened, and where they needed additional help, that the highway patrol was trained to provide this help. And the training, of course, went on in a very orderly but expedited fashion. They were equipped with special equipment and were available on very short notice. And so many times in the state, I don't know how many, but probably over or close to 100, certain elements of the highway patrol were made available, and sometimes in different ways. Sometimes they would be made available in a community where they would be very readily known that they were there. They would make no effort at all to conceal their whereabouts. Other times they might be stashed away where they wouldn't be detected in a nearby community, but nonetheless available. The point was that they would be available to function under the leadership of the chief of police of the town involved. And so they were supportive to the local police effort. And then in our second year in office, because of and incidentally, when the riot took place at Detroit, I was back east in another state, and when I read about it, and at that time we had completed our statewide law enforcement plan, but I realized because of the tremendous numbers involved that our plan was not sufficient to the task if we had a similar situation in Oklahoma. By the time I returned to the state, which was very quickly, had a meeting, I found that the key people with whom I had met before had already met and had come to the same conclusion that I. So we then revamped our plan and found that we could make a number of changes and made it much more important. We had representatives of the Highway Patrol and the National Guard at a number of, or visiting in Newark and in Detroit, Los Angeles, also in Kansas City during their riot. We felt, and we were advised later, that we had one of the top law enforcement plans in the state. But it was based on the idea that our Highway Patrol would be supportive to the local law enforcement. Then, in my second year, we asked for additional emergency powers. These were granted to the governor. This would permit me, or would have permitted the governor, and does permit the governor today, to declare an emergency. And in doing so, at this point, the leadership would change from the local police chief to the adjutant general of the National Guard. This was the unanimous opinion of all the key people involved in the Highway Patrol and the Crime Bureau and all the law enforcement people in the state, that the adjutant general would be the man in charge. Wait a minute, I'm telling this wrong. There would be the senior officer, the Commissioner of Public Safety, excuse me. So let me correct that. It would be the Commissioner of Public Safety in charge of the entire program, and the Adjutant General would be operating under him. This was different from some other states. This was the request of General Weber, and it was agreed by the others. This program, we felt, worked exceedingly well because we were able to have supportive forces available to local law enforcement when the mayors knew that they had no way from their own police forces to deal with situations that were developing in some cities. When it was all said and done, we felt we had a tremendous record because we were the largest state in population that did not have one single person seriously injured in a race riot or a campus disturbance, and we felt this was a very good record.
Why don't you talk about your interagency organization?
Well, a very important part of the law enforcement plan was to have information on those people who might be interested in creating a race riot or a campus disturbance. There were some people who were going from one area to another, helping in certain parts of the country for the sole purpose of disrupting the peace with a race riot. And then later, a year and a half later, with the campus disturbances. And the whole effort here was for us to have intelligence and to have coordination later as the campus disturbances were created between our campuses, so that the college presidents and their designated people would know what was going on in different parts of the state. This proved out, we felt, to be very valuable and very important. When we first started it, we actually had two different agencies doing the same thing. One was in the military department of the National Guard, headed up by Colonel DeFreitas, and another one in the Crime Bureau. Later, the head of the Crime Bureau and General Weber, Commissioner Lester, came to me suggesting that we do away with the department in the Crime Bureau because of the duplication and because of the good job that Colonel DeFreitas was doing. Well, the reason for and it was very important that the National Guard have its own sources of information, so that if it were called in on an emergency basis to provide law and order in the state, that they would have a feel for what had gone on. I think this was one of the problems, and one of several problems that existed the first time or two that the National Guard was called out in different states, California and also in Detroit. They were had no feel for what was going on in the civilian community in the ghettos, and so they were not as well equipped to utilize their manpower as intelligently as they would be if they really had a feel for the temperament of the times and of the people. Also, it was another reason for placing it in the military department and it was a very good one. Since this information is very sensitive, it removed it from an active law enforcement agency, the Crime Bureau, and put it in the military department, which in normal conditions is not a law enforcement agency and could not, on its own directive, use this information. We felt this was very important, and so this was another reason it was done. I think that the Office of Interagency Coordination proved itself very well, because I don't know of, first place, the good record we had, and there was not one criticism of any misuse of this information. I'd like to emphasize that the purpose that we had was to safeguard the rights of all people, all the people in the state, and including the right of the dissident who wanted to speak out very blatantly and abruptly and critically, but legally, so that his person would be safeguarded. And there's no question in my mind that those who were speaking out were able to do so because law and order existed. Freedom of speech does not exist where there's anarchy, and it's most important that order be preserved, and it was for all concerned. We were also using any information we could obtain through the Office of Interagency Coordination to learn of particular speeches that might arouse the emotions from Governor Wallace or from anybody that might lead to some riots. We were not in any way interfering with anyone's right to freedom of speech, to speak out, to assemble, but we were alert to situations that might be a little emotional and might lead to some real trouble, so that we could be on hand and available to quell anything that did develop. I think the program we had, one that we continually reviewed, an updated training program that was quite detailed, of course included a lot of training for the Guard and coordination between the Guard and the Highway Patrol, a number of training sessions involving large numbers of troops paid off. And I think we got through a very difficult time in very good shape.
Why don't you tell us about the Okie Pin, how it came about, what the OKIE stands for, where you got the idea, and a little bit about the interest that it created nationally.
The Jordan Coomer, a advertising firm in Oklahoma City, was a firm that that was handling public relations for the Industrial Development Department. And they came to me one day with a suggestion of the Okie program, and they had a design of an Okie Pin that would be worn by Oklahomans. At that time, we were getting a number of requests for different kinds of things that could be worn, or something that people going to conventions could wear that would be sort of indicative of Oklahoma, that would help sell the state or be a conversation starter, and we really didn't come up with anything. And so I realized that this could very well be a very good method of advertising the state. But of course much more was involved here, because here was a word that was never used in Oklahoma. It was a word that you never saw in the paper, and it sort of hung as a cloud over the state ever since John Steinbeck's book on Oklahoma. So there was a lot more risk in using it, particularly using it as a name for an industrial development program of the state, where we certainly didn't want to become involved in an argument with the people or the editors of papers over the name of our industrial development program. So I sort of shelved the idea for a while, until one day I happened to be at a relatively small dinner with Mr. Gaylord, and I thought, well, I guess this would be a good time to approach him on it, and if he's opposed to it, well, that'll solve my problem. I won't have to worry about it anymore. And so I asked him what he thought about it, and really to my surprise, he said he thought it was great and that I should push it. Well, about that same time, I think just a little ahead of this, I had given a commencement address at OSU on the idea of pride in Oklahoma. And then this was picked up by the Tulsa World and the Oklahoman with very large editions of their paper, emphasizing pride in Oklahoma, giving a lot of history. And so then we were trying very hard to come up at that time with something to continue this pride in Oklahoma approach. And so with Mr. Gaylord's response saying he thought it was a good idea and that he would very willingly support it, we then very quickly made an effort to contact the press around the state and found very strong support for the idea. We proceeded ahead with the design of the Okie Pin. I was sorry that the first pin was made by a company in Texas, but later a company in Oklahoma, Don White Products, headed up by Don White and Noble, made it and is making it today. The idea was that it would stand for Oklahoma Key to Intelligence and Enterprise, and later developed into Oklahoma Key for Industrial Expansion, and it became a badge that many people wore. We also created an Okie certificate. I appeared on Governor and JJ, a television program, and we were successful in writing a couple lines in that which I said that what Will Rogers said about the Okie Pin, or about the Okies, was that when the Okies left Oklahoma and went to California, it raised the IQ of both states. So this gave us an opportunity to tell a good joke around the country, and I think the Okie Pin, the Okie program, the Okie certificate has proved itself as a very valuable asset to the state in many ways. I know that a number of the people in the FAA would use Okie certificates and Okie pins all over the country. People in other nations like them. They think it's a rather interesting thing. But I think more important than that, we took the name Okie, which was a bad name, and made it a good name. And one time I was with a British, member of the British Embassy, and with a very distinct British accent, after I made him an Okie and explained to him what it was, he was familiar with Steinbeck's book, and so he found the whole thing very interesting, and he said, well, what you've done is taken a lemon and made it into lemonade.
You made a lot of calls on industrial people. I understood that you made a lot of phone calls to heads of industries, talking to them about coming to Oklahoma. I'd be interested in your talking about some of the specific companies that you called where, as a result, or at least partly as a result of the call, a result came about.
Well, one was Dalton Foundries in Cushing. They were carrying on a many-state quest for a new location for another plant, and Matt Dalton and I have become very good friends now. They have a plant in Cushing, and he said that he was very much impressed by the fact that when the call came through, I was on the other end of the line talking about some of the attractive sites that we had in Oklahoma. Later on, he and his wife Marion had lunch with us at the mansion. Our industrial development people showed them a number of different towns and communities. People in Tulsa, even although Tulsa was not one of the prospective areas, met with Mrs. Dalton, Marion Dalton, and showed them some of the sites in Tulsa, some of the attractions there, because they were interested in that area. Well, they ended up in Cushing and are a great asset to Oklahoma. Another example, which was very interesting, incidentally, I called these calls my one-a-day brand, but actually I averaged about 2 or 3 calls a day to various officials of the larger companies and other companies that our industrial development department was working on. I got a call one day from Bud Wilkinson. He had been in a golf tournament with the head of Dayton Tire and Rubber Company in Dayton, Ohio. And he said that they had a good golf game, and when it was over, why, the president told him that they were considering, a very confidential basis, but considering having a new plant, and we're going to look in the Southwest. Well, within probably within just a few hours, I was on the phone talking with him, and within a few days, 2 members, Jim Trickett of my staff and what's his name, Jay Casey of the Industrial Development Department, and I were on our way to Dayton, and we visited there, had to spend a full day with them, and after quite some time, the job of attracting jobs through industry to a state is a very interesting one, very challenging one, and many times a very disappointing one, because there are always lots and lots of delays. And there were many delays in this case, but finally, though, the plant, the decision was made to locate in Oklahoma City, and of course it's here. I think it'll probably be expanding right away, and is offering employment to many, many people in Oklahoma. So this one came about through a very alert ears of Bud Wilkinson, who's, of course, been a very good friend to Oklahoma in many ways.
Can you think of any others on that? Hate to end on a negative note in your career, but I believe the first election you lost was your re-election race for governor of Oklahoma, and I'm sure that since you're still involved in politics, that certainly you've done a postmortem on that. What do you feel were the factors leading to your very close defeat in that re-election race?
Well, I think there were many factors. I woke up one night and shortly after the election, and a lot of different reasons for losing the election went through my mind, so I just got up and listed over 30. That could have been the reason for the difference, because the difference was some 2,300 and some votes, and about less than 2/3 of a vote per precinct. But I think the main difference, and the reason that I kicked myself a lot in the rear end over it, was the fact that I should have known that we were in trouble. I just think it was quite obvious that we had to be in trouble with so much apathy for a Republican in a statewide race. I think if I had had the sense to realize this, which I should have, and had said that we were in trouble, and if we didn't get out our vote and work very hard on election day, we were going to lose the election. I think if I had done this, we would have won. We failed to deliver our vote on election day, and I take the full blame for this.
Do you feel that the Greg Garber thing had a noticeable effect on the election?
Yes.
Do you have any other thoughts of things that we may have missed in your career that that you feel are significant that may have happened during these 4 years that I may have overlooked, or do you think there are any stories or any untold stories that maybe should be recorded for history that you might like to add to what we've already done?
Well, Penn, I really can't think of any. I compliment you on the questions you asked me. I think they were very meaningful, very probing, and certainly some of the areas of what I consider great interest during our 4-year period. There were, of course, lots of things, and the thinking I've done so far certainly stimulates more, and I'm sure I could talk till I'd be hoarse about it. I know in our first administration, the key thing then that we wanted to do was to, as far as our legislative program, we were willing to gamble it with the legislature in order to make our selection on the tax commission, because we felt that this would, their previous governors had not selected their own member of the tax commission for a long time, and we were determined we could do it through the courts if necessary, and so advised the legislature. And so none of our program passed, nor were any of our appointments confirmed until the waning days of the legislature, and we were willing to gamble all that in order to make our appointment. Well, so our appointment was made of Clarence DeWeese. There were many modernization programs made in the tax commission, making it a much more viable commission and more active, and it resulted in a very sharp increase in the number of taxpayers and the taxes collected, and certainly I think was an important contribution to the state. But it was an interesting one because of the play that was taking place behind the scenes between our people and the members of the legislature concerning our program and our appointments. And finally, I know counsel for the other side was convinced that we were legally right and on good ground, and that's when they decided to go along with us. But I think this turned out to be a very good thing for the citizens of the state.
I hate to have to close off because I know we could go a long time, but I know the place and time at your next appointment, and for this reason I believe that we will. This has been an interview April 13th in Oklahoma City. This is a program of the Oklahoma Living Legends, co-sponsored by the Oklahoma Historical Society and Oklahoma Christian College, and this interview is being made April 13th, 1972 on the campus of Oklahoma Christian College with Governor Dewey Bartlett.